Hello everyone, my name is Abhinav and I'm a PhD student at the School of Photovoltaic and Renewable Energy Engineering at UNSW Sydney. And today I'm going to be talking about how certain solar energy conversion concepts might be affected by the fact that the solar photon flux is discrete and in some sense can be considered sparse. I'd like to start by talking about the solar photon flux. On the left here, you see I've plotted the spectral irradiance of the AM 1.5G solar spectrum, something we're all familiar with. And on the right, I've transformed it to a spectral photon flux density. The total integrated solar photon flux over this curve is a really large number. Then how could this affect solar energy conversion concepts, and in what sense could it be considered sparse? In this talk, I will be focusing on advanced solar energy conversion concepts that aim to combat one or more of fundamental losses in a single junction solar cell, seen in this figure as a function of bandgap. So the main losses are transmission, which correspond to low energy photons that are not absorbed, and thermalization of high energy carriers. I will be focusing on concepts that utilize low-energy photons. And here I've shown triplet-triplet annihilation as an example of upconversion, which involves the absorption of two or more low-energy photons, which then through a series of interactions and energy transfers lead to an emission of a high-energy photon, which can then be absorbed by the main device. On the other hand, hot carrier solar cells work by maintaining carriers at a temperature higher than that of the lattice and extracting them via energy selective contacts. This combats thermalization losses, hence allows hot carrier solar cells to have small band gaps and absorb low energy photons. However, it's important that carriers scatter off each other and form the high temperature distribution for hot carrier solar cells to function. In fact, both upconversion and hot carrier solar cells require interaction between molecules or carriers and energy redistribution for them to function. And the demonstrated efficiencies of these concepts have been low, and they've primarily been studied under laser illumination and not practical solar conditions. So how does this need for interaction relate to the solar photon flux? Here we consider a generic concept that requires interaction. So if you already have an excitation present, shown here in red, it needs another species to be excited for it to interact with. Now these interactions typically occur at a specific spatial range. So we define sigma effective, which is the effective absorption cross-section of the species that are within range of the excitation. And of course, the excitation also has a lifetime. Using these parameters, we define a cylinder, and on average, it's the photons arriving within this cylinder that are absorbed and result in an excitation that can interact with one that's already present. We call this average number of photons average NP, and it's defined as shown here. Now, even if your photon flux is large, as we saw maybe was the case with solar photon flux, if your sigma effective and lifetime are low, then the average NP can still be a small number. And you can see that in the figure here. For the same photon flux, small volume versus large volume, the average number of photons within this cylinder is different. We searched through the literature for parameters of popular concepts such as lanthanide-doped upconverting nanoparticles, triplet-triplet annihilation, semiconductor upconverting quantum dots, hot carrier solar cells, and we also take two-photon absorption as an extreme example. On the figure on the right, you can see the different mechanisms associated with the various upconversion schemes. And on the figure on the left, you can see on the y-axis, we have the square root of the effective absorption cross-section, the length scale, and the x-axis is the lifetime, and the color tells you the average NP. First, I'd like to point out the extreme position of TPA. It's got really low NP, and that's to be expected because it's a nonlinear optical process and is known to be extremely inefficient at low intensities such as at 1 sun. But some of the other concepts have relatively low NPs as well. Here we have a line of NP equals 1, and this in some sense is a minimum. You need on average at least one other excitation in the volume for an interaction to occur. While TTA goes over this line, according to this analysis, several concepts still need improvements to go above it. It is to be noted that this literature search is by no means exhaustive, but just a general indication of the typical values in the literature. Next, we would like to relate this average NP to some measure of efficiency. We do this for upconversion by using this general model. We define an excitation rate and a decay rate using the parameters we've been discussing, and we assume that any intermediate energy processes are 100% efficient and instantaneous. And we also assume instantaneous upconversion when two excitations are present. Using this, we can relate this average NP to an upconversion quantum yield. UCQY is defined as a ratio between the number of upconverted photons emitted to the number of photons absorbed. Since at least 2 photons need to be absorbed to emit 1 upconverted photon, this UCQY is limited to less than a half. So on the right here we have the same color plot as before, but instead of average NP, the color now tells you the upconversion quantum yield. And we can see that at 1 sun, many of the technologies are well below the ideal of 50% currently. And you can see that the saturation region extends a bit when you concentrate your sunlight because the photon flux is higher. So this is an indication of the level of improvement that might be required for some technologies to achieve the upconversion quantum yields that are needed. We can take a look at a slice through the plot seen in the previous slide at a length scale of 1 nanometer, which corresponds to a typical sigma effective. And we can see that the minimum lifetime required for the upconversion quantum yield to saturate changes depending on how much you concentrate sunlight. And the saturation regime is important because it corresponds to a linear dependence between the incident and emitted light intensities in upconversion. And this is quite important to achieve efficient upconversion. With that, I would like to conclude. We've shown that the particulate nature of sunlight and the photon flux of sunlight affects the performance of solar energy conversion concepts that require interaction. And this efficiency is limited by their lifetimes, interaction length scales, and absorption cross-sections. We've also studied the literature and found that hot carrier solar cells and several upconversion concepts need improvements to absorb enough photons under 1 sun for efficient operation. We've also shown a general upconversion quantum yield model that shows that several popular upconversion schemes are currently limited to UCQYs that are below 50%. And these are some of the references that were used in the analysis. And thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.